Her touch caressed me, and her voice murmured, whispered above me, around me, "Who shall be thy companion? Who shall console thee if I die?" I saw a flowering thicket to the left of her stir a little. Matara was ready. I cried aloud, "Return!" She leaped up. The box fell, the pearls streamed at her feet. The big Dutchman by her side rolled menacing eyes through the still sunshine. The gun went up to my shoulder. I was kneeling, and I was firm, firmer than the trees, the rocks, the mountains. But in front of the steady long barrel, the fields, the house, the earth, the sky swayed to and fro like shadows in a forest on a windy day. Matara burst out of the thicket. Before him the petals of torn flowers whirled high, as if driven by a tempest. I heard her cry. I saw her spring with open arms in front of the white man. She was a woman of my country, and of noble blood. They are so. I heard her shriek of anguish and fear, and all stood still. The fields, the house, the earth, the sky stood still, while Matara leaped at her with uplifted arm. I pulled the trigger, saw a spark, heard nothing. The smoke drove back into my face, and then I could see Matara roll over head first and lie with stretched arms at her feet. Ah, a sure shot. The sunshine fell on my back colder than the running water. A sure shot. I flung the gun after the shot. Those two stood over the dead man as though they had been bewitched by a charm. I shouted at her, "Live and remember!" Then for a time I stumbled about in a cold darkness. Behind me there were great shouts, the running of many feet. Strange men surrounded me, cried meaningless words into my face, pushed me, dragged me, supported me. I stood before the big Dutchman. He stared as if bereft of his reason. He wanted to know. He talked fast. He spoke of gratitude. He offered me food, shelter, gold. He asked many questions. I laughed in his face. I said, "I am a Korinchi traveler from Perak over there, and know nothing of that dead man. I was passing along the path when I heard a shot, and your senseless people rushed out and dragged me here." He lifted his arms. He wondered. He could not believe. He could not understand. He clamored in his own tongue. She had her arms clasped round his neck, and over her shoulder stared back at me with wide eyes. I smiled and looked at her. I smiled and waited to hear the sound of her voice. The white man asked her suddenly, "Do you know him?" I listened. My life was in my ears. She looked at me long. She looked at me with unflinching eyes, and she said aloud, "No, I never saw him before." What, never before? Had she forgotten already? Was it possible? Forgotten already, after so many years of wandering, of companionship, of trouble, of tender words, forgotten already? I tore myself out from the hands that held me and went away without a word. They let me go. I was weary. Did I sleep? I do not know. I remember walking upon a broad path under a clear starlight, and that strange country seemed so big, the rice fields so vast, that as I looked around my head swam with the fear of space. Then I saw a forest. The joyous starlight was heavy upon me. I turned off the path and entered the forest, which was very somber. and very sad. Chapter 5. Karain's tone had been getting lower and lower, as though he had been going away from us, till the last words sounded faint but clear, as if shouted on a calm day from a very great distance. He moved not. He stared fixedly past the motionless head of Hollis, who faced him as still as himself. Jackson had turned sideways, and with elbow on the table shaded his eyes with the palm of his hand. And I looked on, surprised and moved. I looked at that man, loyal to a vision, betrayed by his dream, spurned by his illusion, and coming to us unbelievers for help, against a thought. The silence was profound, but it seemed full of noiseless phantoms, of things sorrowful, shadowy, and mute, in whose invisible presence the firm, pulsating beat of the two ships' chronometers, ticking off steadily the seconds of Greenwich time, seemed to me a protection and a relief. Karain stared stonily, and looking at his rigid figure, I thought of his wanderings, of that obscure odyssey of revenge, of all the men that wander amongst illusions, of the illusions as restless as men, of the illusions faithful, faithless, of the illusions that give joy, that give sorrow, that give pain, that give peace, of the invincible illusions that can make life and death appear serene, inspiring, tormented, or ignoble. A murmur was heard. That voice from outside seemed to flow out of a dreaming world into the lamplight of the cabin. Karain was speaking. I lived in the forest. She came no more. Never, never once. I lived alone. She had forgotten. It was well. I did not want her. I wanted no one. But I found an abandoned house in an old clearing. Nobody came near. Sometimes I heard in the distance the voices of people going along a path. I slept. I rested. There was wild rice, water from a running stream, and peace. Every night I sat alone by my small fire before the hut. Many nights passed over my head. Then one evening, as I sat by my fire after having eaten, I looked down on the ground and began to remember my wanderings. I lifted my head. I had heard no sound, no rustle, no footsteps. But I lifted my head. A man was coming towards me across the small clearing. I waited. He came up without a greeting and squatted down into the firelight. Then he turned his face to me. It was Matara. He stared at me fiercely with his big sunken eyes. The night was cold. The heat died suddenly out of the fire, and he stared at me. I rose and went away from there, leaving him by the fire that had no heat. I walked all that night, all next day, and in the evening made up a big blaze and sat down to wait for him. He had not come into the light. I heard him in the bushes here and there, whispering, whispering. I understood at last. I had heard the words before. You are my friend. Kill with a sure shot. I bore it as long as I could, then leaped away, as on this very night I leaped from my stockade and swam to you. I ran, crying like a child, left alone and far from the houses. He ran by my side without footsteps, whispering, whispering, invisible and heard. I sought people. I wanted men around me, men who had not died, and again we two wandered. I sought danger, violence, and death. I fought in the Atje War, and the brave people wondered at the valiance of a stranger. But we were two. He warded off the blows. Why? I wanted peace, not life. And no one could see him. No one knew. I dared tell no one. At times he would leave me, but not for long. Then he would return and whisper or stare. My heart was torn with a strange fear, but could not die. Then I met an old man. You all knew him. People here called him my sorcerer, my servant and sword-bearer. But to me he was father, mother, protection, refuge, and peace. When I met him, he was returning from a pilgrimage, and I heard him intoning the prayer of sunset. He had gone to the holy place with his son, his son's wife, and a little child. And on their return, by the favor of the Most High, they all died. The strong man, the young mother, the little child, they died. And the old man reached his country alone. He was a pilgrim, serene and pious, very wise and very lonely. I told him all. For a time we lived together. He said over me words of compassion, of wisdom, of prayer. He warded from me the shade of the dead. I begged him for a charm that would make me safe. For a long time he refused, but at last, with a sigh and a smile, he gave me one. Doubtless he could command a spirit stronger than the unrest of my dead friend. And again I had peace. But I had become restless and a lover of turmoil and danger. The old man never left me. We traveled together. We were welcomed by the great. His wisdom and my courage are remembered where your strength, O white men, is forgotten. We served the Sultan of Sula. We fought the Spaniards. There were victories, hopes, defeats, sorrow, blood, women's tears. What for? We fled. We collected wanderers of a warlike race, and came here to fight again. The rest you know. I am the ruler of a conquered land, a lover of war and danger, a fighter and a plotter. But the old man has died, and I am again the slave of the dead. He is not here now to drive away the reproachful shade, to silence the lifeless voice. The power of his charm has died with him, and I know fear, and I hear the whisper, kill, kill, kill. Have I not killed enough? For the first time that night, a sudden convulsion of madness and rage passed over his face. His wavering glances darted here and there like scared birds in a thunderstorm. He jumped up shouting, "By the spirits that drink blood, by the spirits that cry in the night, by all the spirits of fury, misfortune, and death, I swear some day I will strike into every heart I meet. He looked so dangerous that we all three leaped to our feet, and Hollis, with the back of his hand, sent the kris flying off the table. I believe we shouted together. It was a short scare, and the next moment he was again composed in his chair, with 3 white men standing over him, in rather foolish attitudes. We felt a little ashamed of ourselves. Jackson picked up the kris, and after an inquiring glance at me, gave it to him. He received it with a stately inclination of the head, and stuck it in the twist of his sarong, with punctilious care to give his weapon a pacific position. Then he looked up at us with an austere smile. We were abashed and reproved. Hollis sat sideways on the table, and holding his chin in his hand, scrutinized him in pensive silence. I said, "You must abide with your people. They need you, and there is forgetfulness in life. Even the dead cease to speak in time.
Am I a woman to forget long years before an eyelid has had the time to beat twice?
He exclaimed with bitter resentment. He startled me. It was amazing. To him, his life, that cruel mirage of love and peace, seemed as real, as undeniable as theirs would be to any saint, philosopher, or fool of us all. Hollis muttered, "You won't soothe him with your platitudes." Karain spoke to me. "You know us. You have lived with us. Why? We cannot know. But you understand our sorrows and our thoughts. You have lived with my people, and you understand our desires and our fears. With you I will go, to your land, to your people who live in unbelief, to whom day is day and night is night, nothing more. Because you understand all things seen and despise all else, to your land of unbelief, where the dead do not speak, where every man is wise and alone and at peace." "Capital description," murmured Hollis with the flicker of a smile. Karain hung his head. "I can toil and fight and be faithful," he whispered in a weary tone, "but I cannot go back to him who waits for me on the shore. No, take me with you, or else give me some of your strength, of your unbelief, a charm." He seemed utterly exhausted. "Yes, take him home," said Hollis, very low, as if debating with himself. "That would be one way. The ghosts there are in society, and talk affably to ladies and gentlemen, but would scorn a naked human being like our princely friend. Naked, flayed, I should say. I am sorry for him. Impossible, of course. The end of all this shall be," he went on, looking up at us, "the end of this shall be that some day he will run amok amongst his faithful subjects and send ad patres ever so many of them before they make up their minds to the disloyalty of knocking him on the head." I nodded. I thought it more than probable that such would be the end of Karain. It was evident that he had been hunted by his thought along the very limit of human endurance, and very little more pressing was needed to make him swerve over into the form of madness peculiar to his race. The respite he had during the old man's life made the return of the torment unbearable. That much was clear. He lifted his head suddenly. We had imagined for a moment that he had been dozing. "Give me your protection, or your strength," he cried. "A charm, a weapon." Again his chin fell on his breast. We looked at him, then looked at one another with suspicious awe in our eyes, like men who come unexpectedly upon the scene of some mysterious disaster. He had given himself up to us. He had thrust into our hands his errors and his torment, his life and his peace. We did not know what to do with that problem from the outer darkness. We three white men, looking at the Malay, could not find one word to the purpose amongst us, if indeed there existed a word that could solve that problem. We pondered, and our hearts sank. We felt as though we three had been called to the very gate of infernal regions to judge, to decide the fate of a wanderer coming suddenly from a world of sunshine and illusions. "By Jove, he seems to have a great idea of our power," whispered Hollis hopelessly. And then again there was a silence, the feeble plash of water, the steady tick of chronometers. Jackson, with bare arms crossed, leaned his shoulders against the bulkhead of the cabin. He was bending his head under the deck beam. His fair beard spread out magnificently over his chest. He looked colossal, ineffectual, and mild. There was something lugubrious in the aspect of the cabin. The air in it seemed to become slowly charged with the cruel chill of helplessness, with the pitiless anger of egoism against the incomprehensible form of an intruding pain. We had no idea what to do. We began to resent bitterly the hard necessity to get rid of him. Hollis mused, muttered suddenly with a short laugh. Strength, protection, charm. He slipped off the table and left the cuddy without a look at us. It seemed a base desertion. Jackson and I exchanged indignant glances. We could hear him rummaging in his pigeonhole of a cabin. Was the fellow actually going to bed? Karain sighed. It was intolerable. Then Hollis reappeared, holding in both hands a small leather box. He put it down gently on the table and looked at us with a queer gasp, we thought, as though he had from some cause become speechless for a moment, or were ethically uncertain about producing that box. But in an instant, the insolent and unerring wisdom of his youth gave him the needed courage. He said as he unlocked the box with a very small key, "Look as solemn as you can, you fellows." Probably we looked only surprised and stupid, for he glanced over his shoulder and said angrily, "This is no play. I'm going to do something for him. Look serious, confound it. Can't you lie a little for a friend?" Karain seemed to take no notice of us, but when Hollis threw open the lid of the box, his eyes flew to it, and so did ours. The quilted crimson satin of the inside put a violent patch of color into the somber atmosphere. It was something positive to look at. It was fascinating. Chapter 6. Hollis looked smiling into the box. He had lately made a dash home through the canal. He had been away 6 months and only joined us again just in time for this last trip. We had never seen the box before. His hands hovered above it, and he talked to us ironically, but his face became as grave as though he were pronouncing a powerful incantation over the things inside. "Every one of us," he said, with pauses that somehow were more offensive than his words, "every one of us, you'll admit, has been haunted by some woman. And as to friends, dropped by the way, well, ask yourselves." He paused. Karain stared. A deep rumble was heard high up under the deck. Jackson spoke seriously. "Don't be so beastly cynical." "Ah, you are without guile," said Hollis sadly. "You will learn. Meantime, this Malay has been our friend." He repeated several times thoughtfully, "Friend, Malay, friend, Malay," as though weighing the words against one another, then went on more briskly. "A good fellow, a gentleman in his way. We can't, so to speak, turn our backs on his confidence and belief in us. Those Malays are easily impressed, all nerves, you know. Therefore—" He turned to me sharply. "You know him best," he said in a practical tone. "Do you think he is fanatical? I mean, very strict in his faith?" I stammered in profound amazement that I did not think so. "It's on account of its being a likeness, an engraved image," muttered Hollis, enigmatically turning to the box. He plunged his fingers into it. Karain's lips were parted and his eyes shone. We looked into the box. There were there a couple of reels of cotton, a packet of needles, a bit of silk ribbon, dark blue, a cabinet photograph at which Hollis stole a glance before laying it on the table face downwards. A girl's portrait, I could see. There were, amongst a lot of various small objects, a bunch of flowers, a narrow white glove with many buttons, a slim packet of letters carefully tied up, amulets of white men, charms and talismans, charms that keep them straight, that drive them crooked, that have the power to make a young man sigh, an old man smile, potent things that procure dreams of joy, thoughts of regret, that soften hard hearts and can temper a soft one to the hardness of steel, gifts of heaven, things of earth. Hollis rummaged in the box.
and it seemed to me during that moment of waiting that the cabin of the schooner was becoming filled with a stir invisible and living as of subtle breaths. All the ghosts driven out of the unbelieving West by men who pretend to be wise and alone and at peace, all the homeless ghosts of an unbelieving world appeared suddenly round the figure of Hollis bending over the box. All the exiled and charming shades of loved women, all the beautiful and tender ghosts of ideals, remembered, forgotten, cherished, execrated, all the cast-out and reproachful ghosts of friends admired, trusted, traduced, betrayed, left dead by the way. They all seemed to come from the inhospitable regions of the earth, to crowd into the gloomy cabin as though it had been a refuge, and in all the unbelieving world the only place of avenging belief. It lasted a second. All disappeared. Hollis was facing us alone with something small that glittered between his fingers. It looked like a coin. "Ah, here it is," he said. He held it up. It was a sixpence, a Jubilee sixpence. It was gilt. It had a hole punched near the rim. Hollis looked towards Karain. "A charm for our friend," he said to us. "The thing itself is of great power, money, you know, and his imagination is struck. A loyal vagabond, if only his Puritanism doesn't shy at a likeness." We said nothing. We did not know whether to be scandalized, amused, or relieved. Hollis advanced towards Karain, who stood up as if startled, and then, holding the coin up, spoke in Malay. "This is the image of the great queen, and the most powerful thing the white men know," he said solemnly. Karain covered the handle of his kriss in sign of respect, and stared at the crowned head. "The invincible, the pious," he muttered. "She is more powerful than Suleiman the Wise, who commanded the genii, as you know," said Hollis gravely. "I shall give this to you." He held the sixpence in the palm of his hand, and looking at it thoughtfully, spoke to us in English. "She commands a spirit, too, the spirit of her nation, a masterful, conscientious, unscrupulous, unconquerable devil that does a lot of good, incidentally, a lot of good, at times, and wouldn't stand any fuss from the best ghost out for such a little thing as our friend's shot. Don't look thunderstruck, you fellows. Help me to make him believe. Everything's in that." "His people will be shocked," I murmured. Hollis looked fixedly at Karain, who was the incarnation of the very essence of still excitement. He stood rigid, with head thrown back. His eyes rolled wildly, flashing. The dilated nostrils quivered. "Hang it all," said Hollis at last. "He is a good fellow. I'll give him something that I shall really miss." He took the ribbon out of the box, smiled at it scornfully, then with a pair of scissors cut out a piece from the palm of the glove. "I shall make him a thing like those Italian peasants wear, you know." He sewed the coin in the delicate leather, sewed the leather to the ribbon, tied the ends together. He worked with haste. Karain watched his fingers all the time. "Now then," he said, then stepped up to Karain. They looked close into one another's eyes. Those of Karain stared in a lost glance, but Hollis's seemed to grow darker and looked out masterful and compelling. They were in violent contrast together, one motionless and the color of bronze, the other dazzling white and lifting his arms, where the powerful muscles rolled slightly under a skin that gleamed like satin. Jackson moved near with the air of a man closing up to a chum in a tight place. I said impressively, pointing to Hollis, "He is young, but he is wise. Believe him." Karain bent his head. Hollis threw lightly over it the dark blue ribbon and stepped back. "Forget. "And be at peace," I cried. Karain seemed to wake up from a dream. He said, "Ah," shook himself as if throwing off a burden. He looked round with assurance. Someone on deck dragged off the skylight cover, and a flood of light fell into the cabin. It was morning already. "Time to go on deck," said Jackson. Hollis put on a coat, and we went up, Karain leading. The sun had risen beyond the hills, and their long shadows stretched far over the bay in the pearly light. The air was clear, stainless, and cool. I pointed at the curved line of yellow sands. "He is not there," I said emphatically to Karain. "He waits no more. He has departed forever." A shaft of bright, hot rays darted into the bay between the summits of two hills, and the water all round broke out as if by magic into a dazzling sparkle. "No, he is not there waiting," said Karain after a long look over the beach. "I do not hear him," he went on slowly. "No," he turned to us. "He has departed again. Forever," he cried. We assented vigorously, repeatedly, and without compunction. The great thing was to impress him powerfully, to suggest absolute safety, the end of all trouble. We did our best, and I hope we affirmed our faith in the power of Hollis's charm efficiently enough to put the matter beyond the shadow of a doubt. Our voices rang around him joyously in the still air, and above his head the sky, pellucid, pure, stainless, arched its tender blue from shore to shore and over the bay, as if to envelop the water, the earth, and the man in the caress of its light. The anchor was up, the sails hung still, and half a dozen big boats were seen sweeping over the bay to give us a tow out. The paddlers in the first one that came alongside lifted their heads and saw their ruler standing amongst us. A low murmur of surprise arose, then a shout of greeting. He left us, and seemed straightway to step into the glorious splendor of his stage, to wrap himself in the illusion of unavoidable success. For a moment he stood erect, 1 foot over the gangway, 1 hand on the hilt of his kriss, in a martial pose, and, relieved from the fear of outer darkness, he held his head high. He swept a serene look over his conquered foothold on the earth. The boats far off took up the cry of greeting. A great clamor rolled on the water. The hills echoed it and seemed to toss back at him the words invoking long life and victories. He descended into a canoe, and as soon as he was clear of the side, we gave him 3 cheers. They sounded faint and orderly after the wild tumult of his loyal subjects, but it was the best we could do. He stood up in the boat, lifted up both his arms, then pointed to the infallible charm. We cheered again, and the Malays in the boats stared, very much puzzled and impressed. I wondered what they thought, what he thought, what the reader thinks. We towed out slowly. We saw him land and watch us from the beach. A figure approached him humbly but openly, not at all like a ghost with a grievance. We could see other men running towards him. Perhaps he had been missed? At any rate, there was a great stir. A group formed itself rapidly near him, and he walked along the sands, followed by a growing cortege, and kept nearly abreast of the schooner. With our glasses, we could see the blue ribbon on his neck and a patch of white on his brown chest. The bay was waking up. The smokes of morning fires stood in faint spirals, higher than the heads of palms. People moved between the houses. A herd of buffaloes galloped clumsily across a green slope. The slender figures of boys brandishing sticks appeared black and leaping in the long grass. A colored line of women with water bamboos on their heads moved swaying through a thin grove of fruit trees. Karain stopped in the midst of his men and waved his hand. Then, detaching himself from the splendid group, walked alone to the water's edge and waved his hand again. The schooner passed out to sea between the steep headlands that shut in the bay, and at the same instant Karain passed out of our life forever. But the memory remains. Some years afterwards I met Jackson in the Strand. He was magnificent as ever. His head was high above the crowd, his beard was gold, his face red, his eyes blue. He had a wide-brimmed gray hat and no collar or waistcoat. He was inspiring. He had just come home, had landed that very day. Our meeting caused an eddy in the current of humanity. Hurried people would run against us, then walk round us, and turn back to look at that giant. We tried to compress 7 years of life into 7 exclamations, then suddenly appeased, walked sedately along, giving one another the news of yesterday. Jackson gazed about him like a man who looks for landmarks, then stopped before Bland's window. He always had a passion for firearms, so he stopped short and contemplated the row of weapons, perfect and severe, drawn up in a line behind the black-framed panes. I stood by his side. Suddenly he said, "Do you remember Karain?" I nodded. "The sight of all this made me think of him," he went on, with his face near the glass, and I could see another man, powerful and bearded, peering at him intently from amongst the dark and polished tubes that can cure so many illusions. "Yes, it made me think of him," he continued slowly. "I saw a paper this morning. They are fighting over there again. He's sure to be in it. He will make it hot for the caballeros. Well, good luck to him, poor devil. He was perfectly stunning." We walked on. "I wonder whether the charm worked. You remember Hollis's charm, of course? If it did, never was a sixpence wasted to better advantage. Poor devil. I wonder whether he got rid of that friend of his. Hope so. Do you know, I sometimes think that—" I stood still and looked at him. "Yes, I mean whether the thing was so, you know, whether it really happened to him. What do you think?" "My dear chap," I said, "you have been too long away from home. What a question to ask. Only look at all this." A watery gleam of sunshine flashed from the west and went out between 2 long lines of walls, and then the broken confusion of roofs, the chimney stacks, the gold letters sprawling over the fronts of houses, the somber polish of windows, stood resigned and sullen under the falling gloom. The whole length of the street, deep as a well and narrow like a corridor, was full of a somber and ceaseless stir. Our ears were filled by a headlong shuffle and beat of rapid footsteps, and an underlying rumor, a rumor vast, faint, pulsating, as of panting breaths, of beating hearts, of gasping voices. Innumerable eyes stared straight in front, feet moved hurriedly, blank faces flowed, arms swung. Over all, a narrow, ragged strip of smoky sky wound about between the high roofs, extended and motionless like a soiled streamer flying above the rout of a mob. "Yes," said Jackson meditatively. The big wheels of hansoms turned slowly along the edge of sidewalks. A pale-faced youth strolled, overcome by weariness, by the side of his stick and with the tails of his overcoat flapping gently near his heels. Horses stepped gingerly on the greasy pavement, tossing their heads. 2 young girls passed by, talking vivaciously and with shining eyes. A fine old fellow strutted, red-faced, stroking a white mustache, and a line of yellow boards with blue letters on them approached us slowly, tossing on high behind one another like some queer wreckage adrift upon a river of hats. "Yes," repeated Jackson. His clear blue eyes looked about, contemptuous, amused, and hard, like the eyes of a boy. A clumsy string of red, yellow, and green omnibuses rolled swaying, monstrous and gaudy. 2 shabby children ran across the road. A knot of dirty men with red neckerchiefs round their bare throats lurched along, discussing filthily. A ragged old man with a face of despair yelled horribly in the mud the name of a paper, while far off, amongst the tossing heads of horses, the dull flash of harnesses, the jumble of lustrous panels and roofs of carriages, we could see a policeman, helmeted and dark, stretching out a rigid arm at the crossing of the streets. "Yes, I see it," said Jackson slowly. "It is there. It pants, it runs, it rolls. It is strong and alive. It would smash you if you didn't look out. But I'll be hanged if it is yet as real to me as the other thing. Say, Karain's story." I think that decidedly he had been too long away from home. This concludes the reading of Karain, A Memory. The reading of The Idiots continues immediately. The Idiots. We were driving along the road from Tréguier to Kervanda. We passed at a smart trot between the hedges, topping an earth wall on each side of the road. Then at the foot of the steep ascent before Plumard, the horse dropped into a walk, and the driver jumped down heavily from the box. He flicked his whip and climbed the incline, stepping clumsily uphill by the side of the carriage, one hand on the footboard, his eyes on the ground. After a while he lifted his head, pointed up the road with the end of the whip, and said, "The idiot!" The sun was shining violently upon the undulating surface of the land. The rises were topped by clumps of meager trees with their branches showing high on the sky, as if they had been perched upon stilts. The small fields, cut up by hedges and stone walls that zigzagged over the slopes, lay in rectangular patches of vivid greens and yellows, resembling the unskillful daubs of a naive picture,